Sarah Johnson tightened her grip on Emma's small hand as they stood in the middle of the bustling Chicago airport. The sound of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and muffled announcements filled the air around them. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to keep her nerves under control, while Emma bounced slightly on her heels, her bright eyes scanning the terminal. "Mom, do you think the airplane snacks will be good?" Emma asked, her excitement bubbling over despite the early hour. Sarah managed a small smile, her anxiety momentarily eased by her daughter's innocent enthusiasm. "I'm sure they'll be fine, honey. But just in case, I packed some of your favorite snacks in your bag." Emma nodded, satisfied, her curls bouncing as she adjusted her colorful backpack. The two were embarking on a new chapter in their lives, leaving behind the struggles of Chicago for what Sarah hoped would be a fresh start in Seattle. Sarah had landed a promising job, and though the idea of uprooting their lives was daunting, the opportunities waiting on the other side made it all worthwhile. As they approached the security checkpoint, Sarah's heart began to race. She had flown before, but traveling alone with Emma felt different, more vulnerable. She glanced at the long line ahead and the stern faces of the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, agents, silently praying for a smooth process. "Mom, why is everyone so serious?" Emma whispered, her eyes darting to the agents. "They're just doing their job, sweetheart," Sarah replied softly, squeezing her daughter's hand. "We'll be through in no time." The line moved slowly, inching closer to the checkpoint. Sarah noticed the glances, subtle at first, then more obvious. She wasn't a stranger to those looks, ones filled with assumptions and unspoken judgments. Her chest tightened as she met the gaze of a middle-aged woman standing a few feet away, who quickly looked away as if caught. Sarah exhaled, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. She bent down slightly to Emma's level. "Remember, we'll take off our shoes and put them in the bin, okay? Just like last time." "Okay," Emma chirped, determined to be helpful. Finally, it was their turn. Sarah stepped forward confidently, placing their shoes, bags, and jackets into the plastic bins. She gestured for Emma to do the same, keeping a watchful eye on her daughter's every move. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was sharp and clipped, cutting through the surrounding noise. Sarah turned to see a female TSA agent approaching them. The woman's uniform was pristine, her expression as rigid as her posture. Her name badge read Brenda Carter. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Random screening," Brenda replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Step to the side, please." Sarah hesitated, glancing around at the sea of travelers who seemed too preoccupied to notice. "Is that really necessary? We've followed all the procedures." Brenda's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, it's routine. Step to the side." Sarah held Emma's hand tighter as they moved to the designated area. Brenda followed closely, her demeanor unyielding. "Passports," Brenda demanded curtly, holding out her hand. Sarah fumbled in her purse, retrieving the documents. Brenda examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, her brow furrowing. "Seattle, huh?" Brenda said, her voice laced with skepticism. "What's the purpose of your trip?" Sarah stiffened. "I'm moving there for work." "Is that a problem?" Brenda's eyes flicked to Emma, who was now clutching her mother's arm, her earlier excitement replaced by unease. "And this is your daughter?" Brenda asked, her tone implying something far more sinister. "Yes, she is," Sarah said firmly, her patience thinning. Brenda tilted her head, her gaze lingering on Emma. "Do you have proof of that?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" "It's a standard question," Brenda replied coolly. "Do you have her birth certificate or any other documentation to confirm she's your child?" Sarah stared at the agent, stunned. She felt the heat rise to her face, not just from indignation, but from the growing realization that this wasn't just about protocol. "Why would I need to carry my daughter's birth certificate to board a flight?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Brenda didn't answer, her expression unreadable as she handed the passports back. "Wait here," she instructed before disappearing into the crowd of agents. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. Emma nodded, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" "No, baby," Sarah whispered, fighting the lump in her throat. "We didn't do anything wrong." As they stood waiting, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much longer ordeal. Sarah and Emma stood awkwardly to the side, the bustling airport seemingly oblivious to their growing discomfort. Sarah could feel Emma's small hand trembling slightly in hers, a reminder that she needed to stay calm, no matter how humiliated or frustrated she felt. She looked down at her daughter, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Minutes stretched on before Brenda Carter returned, her stiff posture and stern expression giving no hint of empathy. She was now accompanied by another TSA agent, a tall man with a buzz cut and a smug demeanor whose name tag read Mike Harris. Sarah's heart sank further. Brenda gestured curtly to Sarah. "We'll need you to open all of your bags for inspection. Is this really necessary?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've done everything by the book. We've already been delayed long enough." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a routine check," she said, her tone carrying an edge of irritation. Mike chuckled quietly, his eyes scanning Sarah and Emma as if appraising them. "You know how it is," he said, not bothering to mask the condescension in his voice. "Just doing our job." Emma clutched her backpack tighter, her bottom lip quivering. Sarah knelt down beside her and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. Just let them check. We'll be on our way soon." Emma nodded silently, her wide, fearful eyes locked on the agents. Brenda began rifling through Sarah's carry-on bag with little care, pulling out neatly packed clothes and toiletries and placing them on the nearby table. The contents of Emma's backpack followed, including her favorite storybook, a crayon set, and a small stuffed rabbit that she held every night before bed. The rabbit tumbled to the floor, and Emma instinctively reached for it. "Don't touch that," Brenda snapped, causing Emma to freeze mid-motion. "Excuse me," Sarah interjected, her voice firmer now. "She's just a child. Is all of this hostility really necessary?" Mike leaned against the table, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ma'am, if you've got nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem." "Right." Sarah's jaw tightened, the subtle accusation in his words igniting a spark of anger. She didn't reply, choosing instead to focus on keeping her composure. The scene was drawing quiet attention from nearby travelers. Murmurs rippled through the line as people glanced over, some averting their eyes quickly, others whispering to companions. Sarah could feel the weight of those stares, a mix of pity and indifference, as if they were watching a drama unfold but had no intention of intervening. Brenda held up Emma's storybook, flipping through the pages with exaggerated scrutiny. "What's this?" she asked sarcastically. "You hiding something between the pages?" Emma shook her head furiously, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, it's just my book." Sarah stood straighter, placing herself between Brenda and her daughter. "That's enough," she said sharply. "You've gone through everything. There's nothing here. Let us go." Mike chuckled again, shaking his head. "Touchy, aren't we?" Sarah glared at him, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "I'm not being touchy. I'm being protective of my child, which you seem to have no regard for." Brenda ignored her, now inspecting Sarah's toiletry bag with unnecessary vigor, holding up items as if searching for hidden contraband. Finally, she sighed loudly and tossed the bag onto the table, motioning to Mike. "Looks clear to me. What do you think?" Mike shrugged. "Guess they're clean," he said, but his tone was anything but apologetic. Sarah exhaled slowly, relief mingling with indignation. She began gathering their belongings, careful to console Emma, who was wiping silent tears from her cheeks. But as she reached for her bag, Brenda's voice rang out again. "You still haven't shown any proof that this is your daughter." Sarah froze, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Are you serious right now?" she asked, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "It's just a precaution," Brenda said, her tone defensive but unapologetic. "We have to make sure everything checks out." "This is absurd," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm her mother. We're traveling together. That should be enough." The noise around them quieted further as more travelers began to take notice. A middle-aged man nearby frowned at the scene, leaning toward a woman beside him and whispering something. Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Mommy, can we go now?" Sarah crouched down and hugged her tightly. "Not yet, sweetie, but we will. I promise." As she stood back up, she noticed a couple nearby stepping forward. The man, tall with graying hair and a commanding presence, cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the TSA agents. Brenda and Mike both looked at him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "This is going too far," the man said firmly. "They're just a mother and daughter trying to catch their flight. This whole thing reeks of harassment." The tension in the air was thick as Sarah and Emma continued to stand there, still recovering from the verbal exchange. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she fought to maintain her composure. Her eyes never left Emma, who was visibly shrinking into herself, trying to hold back tears. The last thing Sarah wanted was for her daughter to see her upset, but in that moment, she couldn't help the overwhelming rush of indignation. Brenda and Mike exchanged a few quiet words before Brenda turned back to them with an expression that was anything but apologetic. "We need to continue with the search," Brenda said coldly, her voice all business. "If you're not hiding anything, then there's nothing to worry about." Sarah's stomach churned, but she held her ground. She nodded sharply, trying to appear as calm as possible. "Go ahead," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fury rising in her chest. "But this is ridiculous." Brenda gave a thin smile, and Sarah could tell that her words didn't faze her in the least. With that, The agents began their humiliating process. Brenda and Mike worked methodically, moving with a disconcerting level of precision, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. They first moved to Sarah's suitcase, unzipping it with a firm tug. They pulled out clothes, tossing them onto the table one by one. Sarah watched helplessly as her neatly folded shirts and pants were strewn about carelessly, creating a mess that felt like an insult. Her undergarments were exposed, as were some personal items she hadn't even realized were at the top of her bag. "Really?" Sarah muttered under her breath, but the words came out more defeated than angry. The worst part, though, was the way the crowd watched. The stares felt like sharp daggers against her skin. People who'd been waiting in line, who had been huddled together in groups, now stood apart, some shifting uncomfortably, others turning away as if they weren't witnessing the private humiliation of a woman and child. Some even whispered among themselves. Brenda didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She picked up Sarah's toiletries bag next, unzipping it with unnecessary force. Out came bottles of shampoo and lotion, all of them scattered across the table. Sarah's heart sank when Brenda tossed her toothbrush with an exaggerated flick of the wrist, the bristles landing face down. She noticed Emma wince at the sight, the tears she had been holding back finally breaking free. They slid down her cheeks slowly, and Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. "It's okay, sweetie," Sarah whispered softly, kneeling in front of her daughter. She reached for Emma's trembling hands, squeezing them gently. "We're almost done. Just a little longer, all right." Emma didn't respond, but she clung to her mother's words, trying to wipe her tears away with the sleeve of her jacket. Brenda ignored the moment entirely, instead rummaging through Sarah's cosmetics. Lipstick tubes were pulled out and held up to the light. A brush was twirled in the air like a weapon. "Looks like you're a bit of a makeup lover, huh?" Brenda said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. How very typical. Sarah's jaw clenched. Every word from Brenda felt like a slap in the face. "You're done," Sarah said, her voice suddenly sharp. "You've made your point. Can we go now?" Brenda turned to look at her, her face impassive. She didn't respond immediately, but instead started to move towards Emma's backpack, which had been placed on the counter earlier. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself not to snap. She was running out of patience. The bag was unzipped, and out came Emma's belongings. First, the small pink book she always carried with her, a storybook with fairy tales she loved. It was dropped unceremoniously on the table. Then her crayons, dozens of them, scattered in the bottom of the bag, were poured out. They made a clattering sound as they hit the metal counter, and Sarah felt a wave of anger at how carelessly Brenda handled it all. "What are you looking for?" Sarah demanded, unable to hold it in any longer. "Is this really necessary? She's just a child." Brenda didn't answer, merely continuing her search. She reached for Emma's plush rabbit, the one that Emma couldn't sleep without, and pulled it from the bag as if it were evidence in a criminal case. The rabbit, soft and worn with love, was handled roughly and tossed onto the table. Emma's face crumpled, and she instinctively reached for the rabbit, her voice trembling. "Please don't." Brenda didn't stop her, but her eyes flicked to Sarah as if she were daring her to protest. "What's the matter?" "It's just a stuffed animal." Sarah's breath hitched. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out, trying to calm Emma down. She wrapped her arms around her, her heart breaking as she whispered, "It's okay. It's just a toy." But inside, she was fuming. Her daughter, her innocent, sweet little girl, was being treated like a criminal. It was unfair, and it was wrong. As the search continued, Sarah felt as if her dignity was slipping through her fingers. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but Emma needed her calm. Emma needed her to show her that they were strong, and she wasn't going to let this moment destroy them. Sarah's patience was starting to wear thin, but she clung to the one thing that kept her grounded. Emma, the child, still clutching her stuffed bunny, was trembling slightly, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Sarah whispered soothing words to her, trying to shield her from the harsh reality unfolding in front of them. As Brenda continued to dig through their belongings with a methodical coldness, Sarah could feel the eyes of the onlookers burning into her. The whispers, the uncomfortable glances, they made her skin crawl. She kept her posture straight, her shoulders squared, even though everything inside her screamed to lash out, to demand better treatment, to stop the injustice. But she couldn't let herself break. Not now. Not in front of Emma. That's when the first comment came. It wasn't directed at Sarah, but the words stung all the same. Mike Harris, another security agent who had been standing by, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly bored by the delay. He leaned toward Brenda, his voice low but audible enough for Sarah to hear. "You know," Mike said with a sneer, "they must be hiding something. No one acts as suspicious unless they've got something to hide. It's always the quiet ones." Sarah's heart sank at his words. It wasn't just a blatant disrespect. It was the implication that her and Emma's presence there, being black, somehow made them guilty of something. Something that, in Mike's mind, justified this humiliating process. Brenda didn't respond to Mike directly, but Sarah saw the slight flicker of amusement in her eyes. It was as if the cruel comment had been some sort of unspoken confirmation that what they were doing was okay, even justified. Sarah turned her attention back to Emma, who was holding her stuffed bunny tightly, her lips trembling. She didn't want Emma to see her crack under pressure, but it was getting harder to keep the facade of calmness. The shame, the anger, it was all beginning to bubble to the surface. As Brenda continued to sift through Emma's things, pulling out her small notebook, a pack of crayons, and a half-empty juice box, Sarah felt the heat rising in her chest. It wasn't just about her dignity anymore. It was about Emma's innocence. How could anyone look at her precious daughter, with her wide eyes and kind heart, and assume she was a threat? How could they make her feel so small and unimportant? Brenda's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts, sharp and dismissive. "What do you expect me to find in here? A weapon? Drugs? You've got to be kidding me." Sarah clenched her fists, feeling her pulse race. The words were meant to mock them, but they only fueled her fire. "You're wasting our time," Sarah said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "This is unnecessary. We've done nothing wrong." But Brenda was unfazed, continuing to rummage through Emma's bag. Sarah stood there, feeling powerless, watching her daughter's life and dignity being turned inside out for no reason at all. Just then, another voice cut through the tension. It was a man's voice, deep and firm. "Hey, what's going on here?" Sarah looked up, surprised to see a middle-aged man, James Miller, who had been standing further down the line, approaching them with a look of concern. His posture was relaxed, but there was a sense of purpose in the way he moved toward them. Brenda didn't look up. "Just a routine check, sir," she replied, her tone still as cold as ever. James didn't seem convinced. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the scene. "Routine check," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "It looks more like harassment to me." At the sound of his words, a few heads turned. Sarah felt a small flicker of hope, as if someone, finally, was seeing through the unfair treatment. James, with his graying hair and casual demeanor, wasn't intimidated. He was standing up for them. Standing up for her and Emma. Brenda, still focused on Emma's bag, scoffed. "We're just doing our jobs. You can keep walking, sir." But James wasn't backing down. "I don't think so," he said, his tone growing more forceful. "This is crossing the line. These women don't deserve to be treated this way. Look at what you're doing." Rosa Diaz, a woman in her 40s who had been standing behind James, stepped forward. Her arms crossed, and her face was set in a stern expression. "Exactly," she said, her voice loud and clear. "This is racial profiling. You don't get to treat people like this just because you assume they're guilty." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected support, not like this. It was a moment of validation, of solidarity, that she hadn't known she desperately needed. The more people who spoke up, the more the atmosphere around her started to shift. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, more insistent, like a swell of energy building against the injustice happening before them. Brenda and Mike, who had been working in tandem to humiliate Sarah and Emma, seemed to falter. For the first time, they were on the defensive, their actions under scrutiny. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Just slightly, but it was enough to give her the strength to stand tall once more. James turned to Sarah, his voice softer now but still strong. "You don't have to put up with this," he said. "It's wrong, and we're going to make sure it's known." Rosa nodded, giving Sarah a reassuring smile. "We've got your back," she added. "You and your daughter deserve better than this." The support from strangers, people who didn't know her, didn't know Emma, was overwhelming. It gave Sarah the courage to keep going. Maybe this wasn't over yet, but at least, for the first time, Sarah didn't feel like she was alone. She turned back to the agents. "This isn't over," she said firmly. "You've crossed the line, and I won't let this slide." As the voices of James and Rosa echoed through the airport, Sarah began to feel the weight of her situation lift slightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. The hostile tension that had surrounded her and Emma began to shift, though she knew it wasn't over yet. Brenda's eyes flickered toward James, her face tightening in annoyance. She clearly didn't like being questioned, especially not in front of other passengers. Mike, too, seemed agitated. He crossed his arms and muttered something under his breath, but no one could hear it over the growing murmurs of the crowd. "Hey, what's going on here?" someone else asked, a man who had stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. This time, it wasn't just one voice, but several. A woman with a baby in a stroller joined the group, speaking out against the treatment. Others who had been watching from a distance began to speak up, voicing their disapproval of the situation. The collective support of the crowd was palpable. Sarah felt a surge of strength as people, strangers, stood up for her and Emma. "That's right," the man continued, pointing at the agents. "This is totally unnecessary. You can't treat people like this. Not just because of how they look." Brenda's face flushed, but she didn't back down. Instead, she glared at the man who had spoken out. "I'm just doing my job," she snapped, but it was clear her usual confidence was waning. She hadn't anticipated this level of resistance, and it was making her uncomfortable. Sarah looked at the man who had spoken up. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice cracking slightly. She hadn't expected this kind of support. It was like the weight of the world was shifting off her shoulders. Just a little. The woman with the stroller nodded in agreement. "This is wrong. Nobody should be treated like this." She turned to Brenda. "What if this was your daughter? What if someone was treating her this way?" Sarah noticed the looks of other passengers. The passengers who had been too scared or unsure before now seemed to be taking sides. The tension between the agents and the crowd was palpable. Sarah's heart raced as the crowd support intensified. Mike shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. "You people are making a scene," he muttered, but his voice was weaker now, as though the power dynamics were shifting. Rosa, standing next to James, looked directly at Brenda and Mike. "What you're doing is wrong," she said firmly. "It's not just about Sarah and Emma. It's about what you're doing to everyone else who's watching. This is what makes people afraid to travel. This is why there's so much fear in this country." For the first time, Sarah saw Brenda falter. She exchanged a quick look with Mike, both of them clearly unsure how to handle the situation now. The crowd had grown, and more people were joining in, offering their support in hushed voices or strong, defiant statements. People who had been silent moments ago now took sides, and Sarah's heart swelled with unexpected hope. Brenda crossed her arms defensively. "I'm just following protocol," she repeated, but even she could hear the weakness in her words. Her usual forceful tone had cracked. James, not backing down, stepped a little closer to the agents. "Protocol or not, this is harassment," he said. "And I'm not going to stand here and watch it happen." The manager, Robert Taylor, was walking past at that exact moment, having been summoned by another agent who had witnessed the escalating scene. He paused, noticing the crowd and the tense standoff between the agents and the passengers. "What's going on here?" Robert asked, his tone calm but authoritative. James immediately spoke up. "These agents have been harassing this woman and her daughter for no reason other than their appearance. It's wrong, and it's unacceptable." Rosa added, "This needs to stop. Now." Robert took in the scene before him. The visibly shaken Sarah, the crowd of onlookers, the defensive agents. He glanced at Brenda and Mike, noting the discomfort that was now apparent in their postures. He turned back to Sarah, giving her a reassuring nod. "Please, let's get this sorted out," Robert said, his voice steady. "I'm going to speak with you and find out what's going on." Sarah, though still shaken, felt a wave of relief wash over her. She nodded and took a deep breath. This was the moment when things could either get worse or be made right. And now, it seemed, the tide was turning. Brenda shot one last look at Sarah, her gaze cold. But she didn't protest as Robert motioned for them to move aside. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but their murmurs of support remained. As Sarah moved toward Robert, she felt a deep gratitude for the people who had spoken out, for the small army of voices that had stood up when she couldn't. "Thank you," Sarah whispered again, looking at James and Rosa, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me strength." James smiled and nodded. "We all need to stand together. No one should go through this alone." Rosa added, "You're not alone. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." As they walked toward Robert's office, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change if they kept fighting, if they kept standing up for what was right. Sarah felt a surge of determination as she followed Robert Taylor toward his office. The tension in the air was palpable. But now, instead of being a passive participant in this unjust treatment, she was actively pushing for change. With every step, her confidence grew, bolstered by the support of James, Rosa, and the other passengers who had witnessed the ordeal. As they approached the office, Sarah could hear Brenda and Mike muttering under their breath, but she refused to let their words affect her. What mattered now was a chance to make sure this never happened again, not just to her and Emma, but to anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. "Please have a seat," Robert said once they were inside his office, his tone calm but firm. He gestured for Sarah to sit, his gaze softening slightly as he recognized the strain in her posture. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Sarah shook her head, her mind too preoccupied with what had just happened to think about anything else. "No, thank you. I need this to be resolved. Now." Robert nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, and I want you to know that we're going to get to the bottom of this." As he spoke, Sarah's eyes flickered toward Emma, who had been quietly following her mother, her small face pale and tense. Sarah reached down, squeezing Emma's hand gently, offering what little comfort she could. Emma looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly still shaken by the experience. "Emma, it's going to be okay," Sarah whispered softly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. She needed to be strong, for Emma, for both of them. Before Sarah could say anything more, the door to the office opened and another man entered. He was tall, with graying hair and a professional air about him. Robert immediately stood up to greet him. "Mr. Allen, thank you for coming," Robert said, his voice more formal now. The man, Mark Allen, who appeared to be a supervisor at the airport, gave a tight smile but didn't seem entirely at ease. He looked briefly at Sarah and Emma, his gaze flicking between them and the agents who had caused the disturbance. "I've been briefed on the situation," Mark began, his voice apologetic but cautious. "And I want to assure you that we take matters like this very seriously." Sarah nodded, her arms crossed tightly. "I hope so, because what happened here today was not just an inconvenience. It was humiliating. It was racist." Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the weight of her words. "I'm not denying that this situation should have been handled differently," he said. "I've already spoken with Brenda and Mike about their behavior, and it's clear that they didn't follow proper protocol." Sarah felt a flicker of hope rise in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the resolution they had been hoping for. But she wasn't ready to trust it completely just yet. After all, this wasn't just about one bad experience. It was about the systemic issues that allowed such things to happen in the first place. "I appreciate that you're acknowledging the mistake," Sarah said, her voice steady. "But words aren't enough. There needs to be accountability, real consequences." Robert, who had been silently listening, now nodded. "I agree. That's why I've already spoken with our HR department, and we'll be launching a full investigation into what happened here today. Brenda and Mike will be suspended during the process, pending a review of their conduct." Sarah didn't know whether to feel relieved or frustrated by that news. On one hand, it was something, a step in the right direction. But on the other hand, she knew that suspending two people wasn't going to change the culture that allowed them to behave this way in the first place. And what about the larger issue? Sarah asked, her voice firm. This isn't just about Brenda and Mike. This is about the way people like us are treated every single day. Mark and Robert exchanged looks, both of them knowing that Sarah was right. The problem was bigger than any one incident, and it wasn't going to be fixed by simply addressing a couple of bad apples. You're absolutely right, Robert said, his tone softening. That's why, as part of our investigation, we'll also be revisiting our training programs. We need to ensure that every member of our staff understands the importance of treating all passengers with respect, regardless of their background. Sarah nodded slowly, feeling a small sense of validation. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough to spark change. As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself and Emma anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been treated unfairly, for every person who had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin, their appearance, or their name. Finally, after a few more minutes of discussion, Robert turned to her with a serious expression. I will make sure this doesn't happen again, Ms. Johnson, he said. You have my word on that. Thank you, Sarah replied, her voice quiet but resolute. But I need more than just words. I need action. Robert nodded. And you'll get it. The air in the office was thick with anticipation. Sarah sat at the edge of the chair, her arms crossed tightly as she tried to digest everything that had happened so far. Emma, still close by, remained silent, her small body curled into the corner of the room. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure of the injustice they had experienced, but also the growing sense that they were, finally, on the verge of something that might bring change. Robert Taylor had just finished speaking, assuring her that the matter was being taken seriously. She had heard the words, but her thoughts were still racing. Was this really enough? Was it just the start of another corporate apology, one that would vanish as quickly as it had appeared? She wanted to believe that things were different now, but years of systemic injustice told her to be wary. The door to the office opened again, and the final player in this drama stepped inside. Robert stood immediately, his expression shifting from one of reassurance to one of complete professionalism. He extended his hand to the man who had just entered, a tall, middle-aged individual with a neatly trimmed beard and a pair of polished glasses perched on his nose. Mr. Taylor, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me, the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. I'm here to get a clear understanding of what happened. Sarah glanced over at Robert before standing up. She could feel the last of her patience running thin, but she knew she had to push through this. She needed closure, but more than that, she needed accountability. It wasn't enough for her to simply walk away. She needed the system to understand that this was a wake-up call. And if they were truly serious about resolving the issue, they had to prove it. I'm Sarah Johnson, she said firmly, offering a handshake to the new man. And I'm the one who was unjustly treated today. The man, whose name was Robert Allen, looked at her with a calm expression. He studied her for a moment, as if reading her face to gauge the depth of her emotions. I'm the airport manager, he said, his tone measured, and I intend to make sure that this situation is dealt with properly. Sarah sat back down, feeling the familiar tension in her shoulders. I'm sure you know what happened already. Brenda Carter and Mike Harris mistreated me and my daughter. They had no reason to stop us. They treated us like criminals because of the way we look. Robert Allen's face didn't change, but Sarah could see the slight furrow in his brow, as though he was trying to process the full extent of what she was saying. "We take these accusations seriously, Ms. Johnson. I've already spoken with Brenda and Mike, and they've been suspended for the time being." "That's not enough," Sarah replied, her voice steady but firm. "They need to face more than just a temporary suspension. What happened today wasn't an isolated incident. This kind of behavior needs to be rooted out completely, and that starts with them." Alan nodded, acknowledging her frustration. "I understand, and I want you to know that we will be launching a full investigation into their actions, not just for what happened today, but for any other complaints that may exist." Sarah's gaze sharpened. This isn't just about one bad day. It's about a culture that allows this kind of thing to happen over and over. How many other people have been treated the same way because of their race, their appearance, or where they come from? For a moment, there was silence. Robert Allen looked at her as though he was weighing her words carefully. The truth was undeniable. In a city like Chicago, where racial tensions ran high, the truth about the systemic issues within the airport couldn't be ignored anymore. This wasn't just about Brenda and Mike. This was about changing the way things were done. Fundamentally, "We are committed to making changes," Allen said quietly. "I'll be bringing in a third-party firm to conduct a full review of our security procedures, including our training and protocols. This will go beyond just looking at what happened today. We will ensure that everyone, every passenger, no matter who they are, is treated with dignity and respect." Sarah nodded, though she still felt uneasy. She didn't want to be naive. Words were important, but action mattered more. She wasn't about to be pacified with promises alone. "I appreciate that, but I want real change," she said, her tone resolute. "I don't want this to be swept under the rug." Robert Allen seemed to understand her seriousness. He stood up from his chair and extended his hand to Sarah. "I promise you, Ms. Johnson, this will not be swept under the rug. We are making changes, and I will personally ensure that they are enforced." Sarah hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. But this was the first time someone at the airport had acknowledged what had happened with the seriousness it deserved. She couldn't ignore that. "Thank you," she said, still not fully convinced, but willing to give him a chance. Before she could say anything more, Robert Taylor spoke again, his voice more authoritative now. "I will also be making sure that both Brenda and Mike undergo additional training. If their behavior was as problematic as you've described, we'll address it fully." A quiet satisfaction settled in Sarah's chest. It wasn't everything she wanted, but it was a start, and it was a start that mattered. After a few more minutes of discussion, it became clear that Robert Allen was committed to making the necessary changes. Sarah still didn't know whether this would be enough to change the overall culture of the airport, but she knew that she couldn't stop now. She had fought for herself and Emma today, but this fight was far from over. She would keep pushing for a world where no one else had to go through what they had. As she and Emma prepared to leave the office, Robert Allen's words stayed with Sarah. This won't be swept under the rug. For the first time that day, Sarah allowed herself a small sense of relief. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a step forward. As Sarah and Emma left the office, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The tension that had weighed so heavily on them for hours had begun to lift, but it was replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. The confrontation was over, but the ripple effects of what had just transpired were far from finished. Sarah couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride in what she had accomplished. As they walked down the corridor toward the gate, Sarah glanced at Emma, her daughter, who had remained so quiet throughout the ordeal, now held her hand a little tighter. There was a strength in Emma's grip that Sarah hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a fear from what they had endured earlier, but something deeper, something that said Emma understood, even at her young age, the weight of what had just happened. "Are you okay, honey?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but steady. Emma nodded, though her eyes were still a bit red from the tears she had tried so hard to hold back. "I'm okay, Mommy, but I don't want anyone to treat people like that again. It wasn't right." Sarah stopped walking for a moment and knelt down to look Emma in the eye. "You're right. It wasn't right. But you know what? We did something today. We made sure that others who come through here won't have to face what we did. We made sure our voices were heard." Emma smiled weakly, and for the first time that day, Sarah saw a flicker of hope in her daughter's eyes. It was a quiet victory, but it was theirs. As they reached the gate, they were approached by James Miller and Rosa Diaz. Both of them had been there during the ordeal and had stepped in to support them when the security agents had gone too far. James, the middle-aged white man who had spoken out against the officers, was the first to approach. His expression was one of genuine concern, but there was a sense of camaraderie in his eyes. "You two all right?" he asked, his voice warm, though there was a hint of frustration in it as well. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay before you left." "We're good," Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. "Thank you, both of you. You didn't have to step in, but you did. And that made all the difference." Rosa smiled, her Latina roots apparent in her soft accent. "We saw what was happening, and we couldn't just stand by. Nobody should be treated like that, no matter who they are." Emma looked up at them, a small, shy smile on her face. "Thank you for helping us." James chuckled softly, ruffling Emma's hair gently. "It was the right thing to do. You're a brave young lady. You're going to do great things." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she watched them interact. There was still so much wrong in the world, but moments like this made her believe that change was possible. It might be slow, but it was happening, and she and Emma had played a small part in pushing that change forward. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the two strangers gave Sarah and Emma one last nod before walking away. Sarah couldn't help but watch them for a moment, a deep sense of gratitude filling her heart. They had shown up at a time when it felt like the world was against them, and they had made sure their voices were heard. For the first time in what it felt like forever, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Not just for herself, but for the world Emma would grow up in. Sarah and Emma found their seats on the plane, and as the engine roared to life, Sarah gazed out the window, lost in thought. Seattle, the new city, the new life, it was all waiting for them. But now, more than ever, Sarah realized that the future didn't just lie in their destination. It lay in the journey they had already begun. They had fought for what was right, for themselves, and for those who might one day face the same struggles. They had taken a stand, and that was the kind of fight that always mattered. As the plane soared higher, Emma's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. "Mom, do you think things will really change?" Sarah looked down at her daughter, her heart full. "I believe they will. Change takes time, but every step counts. Today, we made a difference." Emma nodded, then leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, closing her eyes. Sarah smiled, running her fingers gently through her daughter's hair. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. They had faced the storm, and they had come out stronger on the other side. And that was the beginning of a new chapter.